Catch up tomorrow.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye. Bye. Okay. Okay, guys, can everybody hear me? I assume you can. I can't. Obviously, normally there's somebody here, would be Claire, to monitor the chat. So I'm going to have to rattle my way through this talk, and we'll pick up the chat right at the end if that's all right. Um, so yeah, apologies. You've got me tonight. I've never I've never done this before for OM system. I've given talks, obviously, many talks, but I haven't actually been left in charge. It's a bit like being a naughty schoolboy. So yeah, they're leaving me in charge. So yeah, my name is Andrew McCarthy, and before we start, obviously we're going to be talking about dragons and damsels. I'll call them Odonts, Odonata. A little bit about me first. I am based down here in the, I hesitate to use the word sunny southwest, the southwest, based in Exeter. I'm a professional ecologist. I have been for over 30 years. That's an old picture, actually. It says 20. It must have been taken 10 years ago. So we do a wide range of consultancy surveys, and I've had a long-standing interest in natural history for that reason. Obviously, I'm an OM ambassador. I'm also a fellow of the Royal Photographic Society, have been for a couple of years, and I sit on their natural history assessment panel with several other fellowship colleagues. So tonight's talk, it's going to be 50 minutes, something like that. Hopefully you can stay for the whole session, and then at the end there'll be as long as we need, really, for questions and hopefully some answers. In terms of content, I've just bullet pointed these. They're not in any particular order, although I'm going to start with kit and camera settings. I'm going to cover things like the kind of weather conditions that you need to be taking into consideration for this type of photography, the kind of lighting considerations that you need to take into account, and some of the problems that lighting can cause you further down the line during post-processing, because the limitations, obviously, of our sensors. We're using Micro Four Thirds kit. I think it's fantastic, but it's got capabilities that we need to be aware of, or limitations, should I say, that we need to be aware of in respect of lighting, and I'll talk about that. I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about composition, because that's the understanding composition and really focusing on composition is the single best way of really giving your images a serious amount of additional punch. And I like to think of it in terms of layering. I'm going to start by talking about portraits, because portraits should be easy, shouldn't they? But actually compelling portraits of insects, odonts, dragonflies, damselflies, other insects too, is actually surprisingly difficult. But there are a number of things that you can do to really help to improve that. And then I like to, once we've got that nailed, and that's understood, then we can start to layer in things like behavior, ecology, ecological function, action, flight, mating, and so on. And we can essentially produce portraits with different layers of interest. So hopefully, as we talk through all this stuff that I've got down here on this page, you'll start to get some ideas for projects, because I'm a firm believer that a project-based approach, rather than just a scattergun approach, randomly going out and looking for whatever comes across, it can be really useful from time to time, but generally I'm a project kind of guy. I just find some kind of focus where you can have an iterative approach to your subjects. You can take a picture or a series of pictures, go out, then come back and refine it, and keep doing that until your images improve is a really good idea. So let's kick off first with kit. What do I use? And I'm absolutely not saying that you can't use other kit. I use the om1 Mark II. It's my go-to body now. I haven't used it for dragonflies and damselflies yet, because I only had it about 2 months ago. I used the om1 for the last year or so, 2 years actually, coupled with a range of lenses. The 4150 f2.8, very good invertebrate lens, particularly when coupled with the 1.4 teleconverter. The 150-400, the lens on the top here, is absolutely fantastic, I think, in my opinion, for dragonflies and damselflies. damsels perhaps less, the smaller damsels, but certainly dragonflies, which are big insects. It's brilliant if focus is close. Without a teleconverter, well, it's with a teleconverter, it's sharp, but without the teleconverter, it's a beautifully balanced lens that's great for telemacro, really. But the 300 f4 is also a superb lens. It's really sharp, shot without the extenders. And the 100-400, I've shot very successfully with that as well. It's a really good lens if you have a good example. Without the teleconverters, it's more than adequate for this kind of photography. I do some macro work. Some of this stuff is closer in, as it were, that I'm going to be showing you tonight. The 60 and 90 millimeter macro lenses, both superb. The 60 mil macro is a really good lens for portability. Anybody who's got it here will know that. It's tiny, it slips into a pocket. So if you're traveling light, and very often I'll be doing a kind of multi-purpose photography session, I'll be out looking for birds. If there's any dragonflies, I'll switch allegiance for an hour or something like that, work with them, but then I can go back again. But if I need to get in close, there's something compelling that demands a close approach, then the macro lens is the way to go. And the 60, it literally just fits in your pocket, so really good. I use a small tripod. I use the Peak Design travel tripod. It's not the carbon version, which I think is a little bit lighter, but there's not much in it. I use the aluminium version. It's brilliant because without the center column, it folds down almost to ground level. It's got an incredibly quick release head and once you understand it, a very intuitive head that just pops out, and with a twist of the ring lock, it just moves to whichever orientation you want it to. Works brilliantly with the big telephoto as well, even though it's a small tripod, very rigid. Remote release, really important, really useful piece of kit for flight shots. And I'll come on to that later. And sometimes instead of carrying a tripod, I'll carry a monopod with a gimbal head, and I use the Wimbley MH100 for that. And that means I can just sit back in the bushes on the other side of a pond with a long lens, looking out at a dragonfly or a damsel on the other side of the pond, or in the bushes or trees or wherever it might be, and stand well back, don't disturb it, and therefore, but you need something to balance the kit on, particularly with a long lens. And all will become clear as we move through. So my basic camera setup, and this is kind of what I call my out of the car setup. So you arrive on site, you don't want to be faffing around with equipment. Faffing, by the way, for our overseas visitors, is a British word. It means mucking about, fiddling about, that sort of awful position you get yourself in sometimes. And I'm sure everybody here will chime with this. When you haven't set the camera up in the way that you should have set it up, and you've got something in front of you that demands to be photographed really fast, and then you realize that actually if you'd done this at home, or you use the same setup every time, my word, wouldn't life be easy? Anyway, this is my basic setup out of the car. I shoot manual with auto ISO most of the time, with the exception of dragonflies in flight, in which case I'll use fully manual. So manual shutter speed, manual aperture, manual ISO. I set my rear function lever in the up and down position to do different types of focus. So in the up position, this is on continuous autofocus plus tracking, all points activated plus eye detect, and I use the bird eye detect. I find that works really, really well for flying dragonflies. So dragonflies swooping around over a pond, occasionally stopping to hover in front of you, works brilliantly. The camera, the om1, I don't think the previous cameras were anywhere near as effective. The om1 and now the om1 Mark II, much better at tracking insects. Well, I can't speak for the two, but certainly the om1 was much better at tracking insects than the previous generations of Olympus cameras. So basically that's fully continuous autofocus plus tracking plus eye detect, fully automatic. So in idiot mode, really, me mode. With a function lever flicked down, I have a completely different setup. Essentially, I have continuous autofocus with a small center AF point that I can enlarge or make smaller if I need to, plus manual override using focus peaking. Obviously, it's one of the main benefits of mirrorless cameras, and it's really, really useful for checking your depth of field. And basically, I use this in tandem with back button focus. It's just, I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying that this is this is the system that I use. It works for me, and I use this for static subjects. So, for example, a dragonfly perched up, facing me, on a waterside plant or in the bushes, I can quickly nail the focus on, say, the thorax. I can very quickly override the autofocus with manual focus peaking, check to see that everything's in focus, and then fire a burst of shots. Very easy. I put my dial, my custom dial settings in as well. C1, 2, 3, 4. C1 goes on ProCap SH1, and I will be looking at this in detail shortly. And I set this by default for dragons and damsels, 8,000th of a second at f7.1. In fact, that should be manual ISO. I've got it on auto ISO, so apologies for that. Should be manual ISO. C2 I have on ProCap SH2, which is the automatic, the tracking version of Pro Capture, if you will. That's just for birds. And I only have it because if I see a bird and I'm carrying a long lens, then obviously I switch back into bird mode. So I don't need to explain that or go over that in any detail here. C3 and 4 have focus stacking and focus bracketing if I want to add depth of field. With a static subject. So I try to keep this as automated as I can. And I try to keep it the same every time because that means I don't have to think. And I've got a very small brain. I've got a very small amount of RAM, and consequently, I need to keep things the same because if I change something, I'll forget what I've changed. Okay, let's launch straight into portraits. And this is a simple portrait of a banded demoiselle damselfly, and it ticks a number of boxes, and it's the kind of portrait that if I'm working with static subjects like dragonflies, or either dragonflies or damselflies, but damsels often perch up for extended periods, particularly in slightly overcast weather, and you might have large emergence, you might have good numbers. I'll spend my time looking for a perch that is quite attractive. This is a nice clean cocksfoot grass head. It's a long way or a decent distance away from the background vegetation, which means that with an ISO, an aperture, I beg your pardon, of 6.3, which is what I've used here, I can render the background beautifully out of focus. And that really makes the subject pop for the viewer. I've composed here using, it's pretty standard, isn't it? I've composed using rule of thirds. So I've got my subject looking into the negative space on the right, subject is on the left, and I've got a little bit of diagonal going on with the wings and the body of this damsel, and a little bit of a diagonal going on with the perch, and that was carefully chosen. There's been a little bit of cropping here, but this is primarily the native file. And just a little bit of interest there in terms of the kit that I've used. This is the 40-150 f2.8 lens, the Pro lens, brilliant lens for this kind of work. Used without the extender, tack absolutely ultra sharp. Used with the extender, still very sharp, 1600th of a second. Yes, pretty good starting point for static work. Once I've nailed this kind of shot, I'll start to try to look for layering in interest, additional interest, or perhaps start to look at flight shots, but we'll stick with portraits for the moment. There's a little bit of extra interest in here. I've chosen my viewpoint here for this four-spotted chaser dragonfly quite carefully because there was an area out of focus area here of reflected light from the surface of the water that was giving almost a blue cast to it, and that to me worked very well when set behind the dragonfly, and it's a really nice clean specimen with broadly intact wings. Little bit of loss there. Look for pristine specimens, I should say. The newer the specimen, the fresher the specimen, generally speaking, the more photogenic it will be, although you need to watch out because the fresher the specimen with what we call teneral dragon and damselflies, they can be really, really shiny, and that can cause you problems in bright light. This particular image also has an added layer of interest. interesting shadows being cast on the reed stem or the reed leaf to the bottom left of the insect, which just adds a little bit of interest. Anything you can do to layer interest in helps keep the viewer's attention on the image, because composition is, if nothing else, it's all about how long your viewer stays engaged with your image. If the viewer just looks at it and goes, oh yeah, that's nice, we've got short attention spans. We're in the age of social media, and actually it's quite hard to retain a viewer's engagement. So the more you can add, the more you can do. Can everybody just make sure that they've, sorry to interrupt, can everybody just make sure they're muted, please? Anybody coming in new, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. Similar sort of shot, but shot slightly up. Now, normally, generally speaking, I'd say that the greatest impact with wildlife photography, and this is true of odonts as much as it is with a fox or a wolf or a bear, is eye level engagement. And this is just shot below eye level because I was looking up at the sky, because the sky was just this beautiful hazy blue and I wanted to include it in the shot. And this is a portrait of a fairly newly emerged four-spotted chaser again, and I just love this, the crispness of the shadows in the early morning sunlight. You can make out every vein on the wing in the wing itself, but also in the shadows, and it just adds that extra layer of depth. And also, the complementary colors, the yellow and yellowy orange in the body of the dragonfly, and the blue of the sky behind, nice and clean, pops really well. Again, rule of thirds, fairly small in the frame. Don't be tempted to go in so close, unless that's going to add to your narrative, and unless you want to use that to say something about the image, to communicate something to your viewer, because composition is all about communication. Think about where you place your subject in the image. I was quite attracted to this common darter female, pristine insect, really lovely, side on to me, landing on this purple loosestrife plant stem, beautiful looking plant. And because of its curved nature and because of its wonderful color, I felt that it was actually it should be included as part of the composition as well. I'm really interested in composition, as you can probably gather, and it's something I bang on about in a lot of my talks, because it's something that we don't think about enough. Think about how each component of the image helps build interest for the viewer. And I just like the way that this particular dragonfly, and this is what they do when they're sunning themselves and they're getting quite hot, they point their abdomen at the sun to help to thermoregulate. I just love the way that you've got a diagonal running through this image from the top right to the bottom left, and your eye runs down to this purple block and then back in. So I think that's don't be tempted to always stick to rule of thirds if you think there's a good reason why. I'm just inviting a couple more people in. Bear with me. Admit all. Okay. Moving on, adding more interest. This is a common darter again, same species, that has recently emerged from our garden pond, and I'll talk about habitats as we work through, because this is a species, this is common in the UK, late season. So just when you're running out of ideas of things to photograph, in August and September, the common darters come on the wing and they provide a lovely burst of fresh insects for our photography, which is fantastic. Now, what this one has done, I don't know, because it's soaking wet, because normally when these guys emerge, they're drying their wings, they've unfurled them. So whether it's fallen in the water and just managed to struggle out up this plant stem, I don't know. But it's even got the strands of algae still clinging to the wings and abdomen. And actually, that helps to just give this sense of circular movement through the image, which again helps. It's another basic tenet of photography or a photograph, is that if you can produce a circular eye movement around the image, will help to keep the viewer's eye engaged. But nice and sharp, soft background, a little bit of texture there to help you give context, I guess, and help the viewer try to work out where it was shot, but beautifully lit. Now, starting to add behavior. I've talked about layering we've grasped the basic principles of composition, starting to add behavior in as an additional layer. So these are portraits. They've used the same broadly guidelines. I hate to use the term rules because, you know, they're not hard and fast. Guidelines, which is nice soft background, tack sharp, you know, everything's in focus where it needs to be. These are my establishing shots. These were both taken within about 2 minutes of each other, down in the Somerset Levels, big wetland site in the southwest of England, last summer. And two pairs of the same species, both mating. This is the classic wheel position for damsels. And on the left-hand side, slightly different and slightly unusual looking position there for mating, with the male clasping the female just behind the head, but the female's outstretched. So same thing. I've shot this. These are not shot. I must say this before I forget. These are shot with single shots. They're not focus stacked. I'm shooting all these with a long lens, not focus stacked, single image, autofocus point somewhere in the middle. So probably with this one, somewhere on the middle of the male, the female abdomen, and then manual focus peaking override to make sure everything is in focus where I want it. And if I'm not getting enough depth of field, I'll stop down a little, or maybe choose a slightly different vantage point. So I'm absolutely plane on, parallel. The back of my camera is parallel to the plane of focus that I want. Now, I'm not saying I don't break these rules. I have with this one. This is a female black-tailed skimmer, I think, and she is in the middle of munching through a blue damselfly. Poor thing. There's not enough detail in there for me to really be certain what it is. And this was a classic, and I'll talk about actually further down the line, a classic case of shooting in the middle of the day when the sun is quite high, it's quite bright, and vegetation is too close to the subject. I've had to make a serious choice about shooting position here as well, because I wanted to get a shot fired off, because she was very skittish. She'd only just landed. It was very warm, and I could have maneuvered myself to get a nice side-on view. But I thought, well, actually, the most important thing about this shot is the fact that the insect is eating another one. It's predating the damsel. So I need to get an establishing shot first, and I wanted to get the thorax, the head, and the insect of the damselfly in focus first. And then if she flies off, at least I've got a shot. Careful control of depth of field. So I think probably about 6.3 to 7.1. But of course, the background is starting to creep in, which is a little bit distracting. But sometimes you've got no choice. You have to go with the flow, and you have to just deal with, you know, things as they are. Obviously, it would be great if it was sitting with a beautiful, clean background like this. Laying dragonflies. This is an emperor, the green form. There are two. This is a female emperor. You can see the green abdomen patches here. There's a blue one, a blue common variety, a blue variety with brighter blue patches. She's laying into submerged vegetation and just balanced on this lily leaf here. And I shot this sitting in the water, so I got a bit wet. Sometimes you've just got to. 300 f4 Olympus OM1, EM1 Mark III. So this was shot back in the day before I started shooting the OM1. And I wanted to get really low. Couldn't quite get low enough without actually being up to my chest in water. But you know, it was low enough, because the higher you are, if you think about this, it makes sense. And this is true for pretty much all wildlife. The higher you are, higher your viewing angle, the more of the background will be in focus, because the closer you'll be to it. So if you can, I'll just have someone else to admit. If you could just admit the person that's just admitted, if you could just mute yourself, that would be really great. Thank you. Yes, the viewing angle is really important. The lower you can get, the more eye on, or side on you can get to these insects, the more chance you've got of throwing that background out of focus and making that image pop, making that subject really pop. If I'd shot this from a normal viewing angle on the bank, it would have all been in focus. The background would have been in focus, and it would have lost a lot of its impact. I've done it even more deliberately here. This is on our garden pond. These are dragonflies of, a wide variety of habitats. These hawker dragonflies are fairly common on, well-established open ponds. Our garden pond's probably 5 meters by 7 meters, something like that. It's not massive, but it's got enough open water for these guys. They love laying here. This is the blue form of the female. I mentioned the green one. You can see that the abdomen here is much bluer, but I've got down much lower because I've created a little area at one end of the pond which picks up the afternoon light and allows me to get really close to the water surface. Having now built the wretched pond, I find it's not quite low enough, and I would have liked the water level to have been another 2 or 3 inches higher. But hey, I thought I was doing a good job, and obviously not. I wouldn't be a pond designer, I think, in another life. But anyway, you can see the effect it has. It throws that background really out of focus. Now, I've talked about layering. I've talked about behavior. So we've got a portrait here of a laying dragonfly. There's some action going on. There's a lovely bit of reflection as well, and that's something I look for a lot. So if there's no water movement and you've got a nice clean water surface, really look out for reflections because they can make your image really, really powerful. As they have here, this was the banner image for the advert for the talk, and this is something I've never seen until this moment. This was taken a couple of years ago, just while I was assembling my final panel for the Fellowship of the RPS. Which I highly recommend, guys, by the way. If you haven't done an RPS distinction, highly recommend it. It's a great journey, and it will really improve your photography from the L to the F, if you're lucky enough to get that far. But I was putting together the panel, and this was photographed on my garden pond, and consequently, I was able to get out on a regular basis. Having a local pond, a local site, means you can get out when the weather's good. And I knew we had laying emperor females, and I had some time on my hands, late morning, good lighting, a little bit overcast, but very bright, quite warm, and the females were coming in, and I was just laying down, photographing the action when two of these insects landed, and they're holding hands. I mean, what is all that about? I've never seen this sort of behavior, but they're both laying. We've even got the blue and the green form, the green on the right, blue on the left here, and you've got a lovely reflection to boot. So really pleased with that. So always be on the lookout for unusual behavior. Speaking of which, this is an azure damsel on our garden pond again. So it's me making the most of the weather, and it's a pair of mating damsels, with the male here and the female who's become completely submerged, as the male has, he's just quite happily sitting there, but the female is completely submerged. I rather like the fact that there's a reflection going on, and it was this pattern here, I think, that really drew me to it. So she's submerged, and you can see the meniscus just dropping down. I didn't stay around long enough to wait and see whether she popped up again. Okay. I can only hope that she was all right, but hopefully she laid and there was another generation of azures. But again, the same techniques apply with the single autofocus, manual focus, focus peaking to check the focus details, and then fire a burst of images, which is pretty much my standard go-to for static portrait, and this sort of action work. So taking this one step further, again, my garden pond, again, looking to fill a number of gaps in my fellowship panel. This one, and like the two laying emperors, this was just like a wow moment. You don't see this kind of thing very often. And this was one of those incidents where you thought, I really can't afford to screw this up. I've got to get this absolutely bang on, because if I don't, I'm missing a real opportunity, because you've got this beautiful reflection below these laying azure damsels. You've got some really nice patterns going on here, with this pair just turned away, these two pairs opposite each other, almost in the same position, slightly different color forms of the females. So there's a lot of interest going on here, and a beautiful colored late afternoon lack of movement on the water surface. And again, same approach. So get that small autofocus point on here, and then manual focus override, check everything's in focus with focus peaking, and then fire bursts of shots, adjust position, do it again, adjust position, do it again. And, you know, once you've got those shots in the can, then you can start to be a bit more creative if you want to. Okay, time for a pause and a mouthful of water, I think, because I don't just shoot single shot. Obviously, one of the strengths of the OM system cameras is that they have this computational photography capability. And for a number of years, since the Olympus days, we've been able to do in-camera focus stacking very, very quickly, which lends itself with the in-camera image stabilization, which is par excellence. It lends itself to handheld focus stacking, which is, you know, a great way of getting additional depth of field. Or if you're uncertain about being able to get enough depth of field with a single shot, you can then try just stacking a few images. On the left hand side, I have stacked the image using the stacking function, and I'll look at this in a minute in detail. And on the right hand side, I've used focus bracketing. So two different systems in different places in the menu of the om1, and in different places on the EM systems as well, the Olympus cameras. But two different functions, really. This is a sort of quick and dirty I like to think of. I use it a lot more than I used to, because the image stabilization is so good. I'm not particularly steady, and you have to be quite well stabilized, but this shot was with about 8 images. So stacking essentially is a stack of images which the camera then uses an algorithm to put them together and produce a final JPEG, final version. And this is the out-of-camera JPEG, tweaked slightly in Lightroom. And you can see that it's got a good depth of field. You know, everything is in focus where it needs to be. So the wing is an emerging common data. The head's in focus, the legs are in focus, the wing's in focus. I'm just starting to lose focus on the exuvia, the larval case here. So that's a bit annoying, but I was working, so I was just surveying some ponds. I had the camera with me around my neck. I didn't have a tripod or a monopod, so kind of 8 is the best I can do. I know people can do more. There are many people out there who claim to be able to do the full 15 shots. Hats off to you. I can't do that. I just introduce errors. On the right hand side, this is a downy emerald, which is a species of clay ponds. It's quite scarce, not particularly common. We get them on 1 or 2 ponds in a particular valley in the southwest near Exeter, where I live. And it's a stunning looking dragonfly. I've got different shots of it later to show you. But you can see the depth I've had to stack over, because essentially the tip here is this part of the wingtip. It's a different dragonfly. And I've stacked right through to the far side of the exuvia, the legs here. And I've got all the legs of the dragonfly in. So I've probably got 2 inches of stack there. And I think I've used about 50 images on the stack. So, you know, it's a large stack. It takes second perhaps to run, and this was taken using a tripod, using an aperture of about f6.3. And I've run the stack through from the tip here right the way through to the point where I've been able to stop it once it's captured everything I've needed it to capture. Now, I've talked about stacking. There may be some of you, because there are a lot of people here, who don't actually know what focus stacking and focus bracketing is. So let me just quickly run through it. So focus stacking, as I said, is you've got up to 15 images. And it allows you to produce a series of slices, if you like, through an image, which you can then use the functions in the camera to stack together to produce a final image, a final JPEG image. You've still got the original RAW files, depending on how you set your camera up, but you've got a JPEG image as well, which 9 times out of 10, if you do it well, is perfectly adequate for social media or whatever. Personally, I prefer to do the stacking manually in camera. And so I will either take the images from the focus stack, or I'll use the images from a focus bracketing. And I tend to do that if I want to use more than the 15 images maximum that the OM system cameras give you for focus stacking. So for example, 30 images. Now, focus differential, something that puzzles a few people. So I'll just say a very brief word about it. Focus differential essentially is the difference between the distance between these in focus slices. Essentially it's the amount of, if you have 2 um, if you have too low a differential, say you've set your differential to 1, and a shallow depth of field, a shallow depth of field, so, I don't know, f2.8, you'll have potential banding. If you have limited stack depth, I beg your pardon, sorry, let's run through that again. So focus differential is the distance between in focus slices. So if that differential is too low, you'll have a large number of images but limited stack depth. If you have it too high, so if you have the focus differential to say 5, 6, 7, something like that, you'll have gaps between these images, and therefore you'll have banding. It'll appear on the final image as banding. Areas out of focus between slices of focus. So you need to be careful. And so typically if I'm doing focus stacking, I'll set my default to perhaps 8 or 10 images with a focus differential of say 2 or 3 with an aperture of perhaps f5.6, something like that. If I'm doing focus bracketing, say I'm using 30 shots, again, I'll usually go for a focus differential of about 3. That seems to do the job with most apertures that I'll use, unless I'm deliberately using a very wide aperture, which 9 times out of 10 I'm not. My starting point would be maybe 5.6, because that would tend to give you more control over your background. Anyway, there's lots of stuff online about this. Focus stacking, focus bracketing. This isn't a stacking and bracketing tutorial. It's a dragonfly and damselfly tutorial, but it does give you the option of being a bit more flexible in terms of how much depth of field you have or able to render in your final image. So, right, let's talk about creativity. Breaking the rules, doing something a little bit out of the box. And so this is a shot with a wide aperture, f4.5 on the 150-400 f4.5 Pro lens. Shutter speed of 2000th, a fairly modest, lowish ISO of 800th. And I've shot this through vegetation, through a gap in vegetation. And I was sitting behind some bracken and watching this female broad-body chaser come in repeatedly in and land on and then bask for a little bit on this stick. And I've used this shooting through a gap technique because it really focuses the eye on the subject, and that lovely out of focus background really concentrates the viewer's attention. And there's just a little bit of detail here to give you some context. So it's a technique I like to use quite a bit. I've done it again here. There's just a little bit of fuzziness around the bottom here where I've just deliberately got close to vegetation in front of the lens, and that has really helped focus the eye on the thorax and the eye of this southern hawker that had just emerged from our garden pond. Fairly wide aperture, so probably go for f4.5, 5.6, something like that. I rarely use more if I'm working creatively like that. Sometimes I'll even work right out, take the extender off on the 4150, for example, and work at 2.8, and really go for a shallow depth of field. Don't forget, when you're out in the field, explore different options for backgrounds, because they can really change the feeling of an image and the emphasis of an image. And particularly on a very, very bright day when, you might sit and think, oh, really, this is just dreadful. We've got, really high scene dynamic range. I'm struggling to get highlights under control, and I'm struggling to get any detail in the shadows. But you can find interesting perspectives, and this was one afternoon, very bright afternoon, midsummer. This is a broad-bodied chaser. You can see he's hot. He's flattening his abdomen here, and but I've included the background bokeh balls, the reflections from the light reflecting off the pond behind, and it's really given quite an unusual background. Becomes part of the image, and worth incorporating for its own sake. And experiment with aperture. Don't be slavishly committed to one or another, but use the aperture to get the effect you want to. What do you do on a grey day? Well, apart from stay at home. Still worth going out if it's warm, because odonts will be on the wing. If they're not on the wing, they'll be resting up. And against a clear, white, pale, featureless sky, it's worth thinking monochrome. Monochrome subjects can work really well with these kinds of insects because they're very graphic. Dragonflies and damselflies have a very particular shape. And on the left-hand side here, these perched up damsels are doing exactly that. They've made this really quite graphic image, which I've just converted to monochrome in Lightroom and added a little bit of contrast, and it produces a really nice rather graphic sort of portrait style image. On the right, I've gone for a 16:9 crop. You'll probably notice that a lot of these images are 3:2. I think that's a hangover from my full frame days. Just what I've always done. I prefer it. I find it gives a slightly more dynamic feel than a 4:3 crop. It's not something I always use, but often I do. Another of my favorite formats is 16:9, so pano, and this is the case here. I've cropped this to 16:9 because I felt that these out of focus stems on the right hand side of the image really added something to the composition. They helped to balance it, but it needed a long panoramic crop in order to make the image balanced from left to right. So don't forget that, even on dull days, it can still be worth going out and getting some interesting stuff. Okay, so I'm aware time is pressing on, and I want to move on now to flight photography, because this is something that has taken a great deal of my time over the last couple of years. And it started really after a conversation with the chair of the Natural History panel, who, when we were talking about images for a final fellowship panel, we discussed how sharp the wings of a dragonfly ought to be included in the panel, and I've since had much discussion about it afterwards. Because I guess if you did a search online for dragonflies in flight, this is the kind of thing you'd find. This is a male common darter dragonfly, beautifully in flight, lovely focus from tip of the abdomen to the head, in focus. Folded legs are in focus too. Obviously the wings are side on to me, so even if I'd had a very fast shutter speed, I wouldn't have been able to get them in focus completely because of a lack of depth of field. So here I've used the om1 of the 150-400, and this is just CAF plus tracking, whole scene, all focus points engaged, eye detect for birds, 8,000th of a second, ISO 3500th. Let the camera do all the work. The only thing you've got to do is get the insect in the frame. Well, that's not easy. Anybody who's tried to do this with dragonflies particularly will know how fast they are. And, I reckon if I can get an insect now in frame, then it's in focus, because these cameras are so good. It's like playing a computer game. But in the days gone by, I'm going back several years, really it was a very difficult thing to do because the autofocus was not fast enough to do this consistently, but now it is. So I think this is the kind of thing you see a lot of, and it's very easy to do. But I want something that's a little different, and I wanted something different for my fellowship panel. So I started experimenting with shots where I'd got some context, because it's nice to have context, whether that's a little bit of background detail, or whether it's a perch or something giving a sense of scale. And you've got here 3 broad-bodied chasers, 2 taking off on the right and 1 on the left landing. And now this is not easy to do. You could do landing shots without any of the computational functions that OM cameras offer you, because it's a matter then of getting a pinpoint focus on the perch that the insect is returning to. And these guys do return, some species anyway, not all, return to the same perch on a regular basis. And they will fly along more or less the same plane of focus. So it's a matter of positioning yourself with a fast burst rate. And then as the insect comes in, fire a burst and hopefully get a nice pose like I did here. But I think flight shots where the dragonfly is just peeling off are far more compelling and far more interesting. And this is what's happening here with this black-tailed skimmer. And obviously, to use this, I've used Pro Capture because Pro Capture is like your history rewind mechanism. It means you can go back in time, and it's brilliant for this kind of photography. And why other camera manufacturers have been so slow in jumping on the bandwagon for this, I have no idea. Nikon are starting to get to grips with it, but I think they are still behind the curve. It's a brilliant system, and coupled for birds, for example, coupled with the focus tracking and eye detect, it works really, really well. However, we're not dealing with birds. We're dealing with tiny things that are really, really fast. And so this is a setup that I use, and but feel free to experiment. Don't slavishly follow me. Use settings, try different things, and have fun with it. But basically, Pro Capture, for those of you who've not tried it, and I know sometimes people get a little bit about these different camera functions, tend to stick to what but for those of you who've not tried it, I would urge you to. It's fun. It's in the top left-hand main menu on the om1 and om1 Mark II, the number 1 yellow menu, and it's in drive mode, which is option 7. And if you scroll down to sequential shooting settings, you can see I've got ProCap SH1 highlighted there. I mentioned earlier ProCap SH2, which is the ProCap function that gives you the ability to use autofocus and tracking. Well, we don't need that. These things are far too fast, and I want to really maximize my frame rate. And so in the bottom box on the left-hand side here, you'll see a pretty typical setting for me for dragonflies in flight. I will vary this if I need to. I'll experiment with it. Depends on the results I'm getting on the day. But this is my kind of, go-to startup. I've got maximum shutter frames per second running, 120 FPS. Wow, that's unbelievable, isn't it? Unbelievably fast. I've got 50 pre-shutter frames engaged. So when my finger is on the shutter button and pressing it halfway down, the camera is rolling 50 shots 50 shots into the buffer. As soon as I press my finger on the shutter button, the camera records all those images that I'd taken prior to the press. Wow. Not nothing not to like about that. It's a really, really effective system for getting these kinds of photographs. In fact, I would go as far as saying it's the only way of doing it, because for flight shots where dragonflies are leaving a perch, your reaction time is going to be way, way too slow. It's hard enough with birds, but for dragonflies, it's really difficult. So, okay, you're working a site like this. You've got a perch you've identified 10 feet in front of you, something like that. You've got your tele lens, you've got your OM whatever camera set up on a little tripod maybe, or you've carried a monopod out with you. So what's your go-to setup for flight shots for dragonflies, leaving the perch as well as landing? So we can do both. So I've got SH1 engaged. I'm in fully manual mode. I've set this as fast as it will go, 120 frames per second. I've got fully manual mode, including manual ISO, and usually my default is 6,400. I usually set an initial go-to speed on a bright day of maybe 8,000th of a second, f7.1. I'll want to stop down a little. Apart from the fact that that's the sort of sweet spot of the lens, it just maximizes my depth of field a little bit, and it means that if the flipping dragonfly comes in at a slightly oblique angle, which they have a habit of doing, they don't always come in or take off along exactly the plane of focus that you've chosen. It means you're a little bit covered. Watch the flight path and align it with the plane of focus. It's true of all wildlife. Observation is key. So once you've observed a dragonfly that's repeatedly coming into a perch, just watch it for 5 minutes, a few minutes, and see which way it's coming in. Is it favoring a particular flight path? And can you position your camera so that you're plane onto that flight path? Because what you don't want to do is to have the dragonfly fly off obliquely to you, because it'll be out of focus immediately that it's left the perch, which is not where you want it. Think about composition. It's very easy in the excitement of the moment to completely forget about how, that this is a portrait with action. And think about cropping later. So, frame it fairly loosely. Don't go right in, because you'll find that the sequence of shots will very quickly leave the frame, but also it means that if the dragonfly does veer off slightly, and some of the later images are slightly out of focus, you should at least get something that's in focus. Focus on the perch for dragonflies coming in. Focus on the insect for dragonflies leaving. Fairly obvious, really. So that, coupled with the flight path and a good position, should get you a shot. I use a tripod or monopod with a remote release. I prefer a tripod because it means I'm lazy, and it means I can sit back with a little chair maybe, or on the bank, and I can just watch the dragonfly. I've got a remote release in my hand, so I'm pressing the shutter button halfway down. I'm recording, I'm recording, I'm recording. As soon as the dragonfly flies off, I press the shutter button. As soon as it leaves, try and time it quickly, and hopefully it should have got a nice sequence of flight shots. Now, this is the kind of thing that you can expect if you've done everything I've just told you perfectly. What I should say is that things rarely go to plan. There's a lot of trial and error in this, and I'm kind of sharing some of the things that I've gleaned over the years, the last couple of years. I started doing this with the Olympus EM1 Mark II, and results were pretty hit or miss. They're still hit or miss, but when they go right, the camera is
Oh,
capable
puppy.
of.
Puppy.
Guys, can everybody make sure that you've muted yourselves, please? Just double check. Thanks very much. So this is an emperor dragonfly coming in from the left to land on this figurework perch. And I just love the position he's in, kind of lunar module mode, legs up, just ready to extend to grasp. Now you can see how fast the shutter speed is. I've gone up from my default out of the car setup at 8,000. I've gone up to 12,800 for f7.1 with an ISO of 6400. Now, back in the days of Olympus, the early generation cameras, that was too much. I've got many shots where I wouldn't really go much above 1600, and of course, you're limited then with shutter speed to 2,500 or 3,200, and that's just not fast enough. My objective with this was to render the wings with detail. It was just what I wanted to do. It was a project that I had, and if anybody's interested, by the way, in my approach to project photography, Outdoor Photography Magazine this month, a UK magazine, a journal which is available online as well, I believe, has an article, a 6-page article on how to apply that kind of project-based philosophy to your projects, because it gives you this ability to shoot, review, shoot, review, shoot, review. It's really powerful way of improving your images. 6,400 now go to as a starting point with the OM1, because it renders sufficient detail at 6,400, maybe to 8,000, maybe even to 10,000 if you're in extremis and it's a little bit of a dull day. You will still get detailed images, and with good processing using Lightroom, I find the AI noise reduction tool on Lightroom really powerful. You could use Topaz, you could use DxO Pure Raw. There are other software packages. They will do the same job. So it's been cleaned up a little bit, but beautiful detail still there. Really nice. Scarce chaser, fabulous insect. Really simple. A portrait, essentially, virtually the same as the first portrait I showed you. But instead, this is an in-flight insect that's just coming into land with exquisite detail in the wings. And what I wanted to do, I guess, was to show how you can take a portrait of an insect at really high shutter speed, 8 thousandths per second in this case, and get absolutely crisp detail with the wings in focus and the wings showing that lovely venation with the background out of focus as well. Damselflies are more difficult because they're fluttery little things, and they are a bit more unpredictable in terms of their patterns of movement off a perch. This I just thought this had lovely lighting. It's beautiful blue sky filtering through the trees in a woodland in midsummer, and coming through these beautiful suffused brown wings of this female beautiful demoiselle perched in a treetop. The camera om1, the lens one doesn't say it here, 150-400 on a monopod, and I just focused on the insect. Pro capture 6,400 as it flew off. Bosh. A nice sequence of shots. I will on occasion use ridiculously fast shutter speeds. The image on the left-hand side was taken for my fellowship panel, and I had a very specific image in mind that I wanted, which is a dragonfly peeling off, and like a banking sort of Spitfire, really, with the wings beautifully in focus. And you can see the sequence here: om1, 150-400 lens, 16,000th of a second, ISO 6400, with a very crisp, very clean, very graphic perch that it's just peeled off from. Beautiful insect, broad-bodied chaser male, one of the species we get over our garden pond. And this was taken on our garden pond, so you don't need to travel to exotic locations to see these guys. I very rarely travel. I try to keep my carbon footprint low. I try to keep my driving to a minimum if I can, and consequently shooting on a garden pond is where it's at for me. Same thing here. This is an emperor male that's just peeled off, dropped away from its perch, and it's just about to bank into a turn to fly off. And again, high shutter speed, 12,800th. And this is the same dragonfly peeled away. So two completely different images in the same sequence. And you can see the detail that it's retained. The camera has retained here. The om1, this isn't the om1 Mark II. And the exquisite detail that's captured in the wings here. So a kind of real action portrait. I've done the same thing here, slightly different approach. I was just really taken by the perch. It was just really simple and graphic, and this is just my style of photography. I like to produce images like this, but I've kind of got a little bit fed up with doing the same thing with a perched up dragonfly. It now needs to be doing something completely live wire. It needs to be in motion. And the image on the right was the dragonfly just coming into land, and the image on the left was the dragonfly peeling off doing its Spitfire impression. And I was really taken every time I watched this dragonfly come in, really taken by the fact that the shadow of the wings caused by the position of the sun just really added another layer of interest. The background is stunning as well. It was just beautifully out of focus, and ISO 5000 didn't need a lot of work in post-processing. A little bit of noise reduction, tiny little bit of contrast, jobs are good. I wanted to say a word about lighting and reflectivity. This is a good conditioned broad-bodied chaser who's just taken off from a heathland pond. These are heather branches here, and I had a sequence of the dragonfly leaving its perch and flying out of frame to the left, and this is the one in which I preferred the wing position. It just seemed to work really, really well. It was flying into negative space, so following all the rules, the rule of thirds. There were other good sequence shots, but they which didn't have this high reflectivity on the wings here. So it kind of, does it spoil it for me? No, it's probably okay. It tells you something about the dragonfly and its wings, but it's a nice positioned shot in the frame, which is what Pro Capture allows you to do. Choose your moment really at your leisure when you're post-processing. Laying hawker dragonflies, taking off shots, almost impossible to achieve manually, I think. And this is a female emperor taking off again from our garden pond. Love photographing there, and you can see the droplets of water from the abdomen as she's lifted away. These guys lift off suddenly and unpredictably, so they can be laying maybe sometimes 5 minutes. So you'll be sitting there with your finger half pressed on the shutter, focused on the dragonfly, and I'll often recompose or refocus just to make sure, I'm doubly sure I'm if the insect moves fractionally, I'll want to make sure I'm absolutely spot on with my focus. Just keep refocusing. And it's sod's law that they will lift off just before you've refocused. Just as you've taken your finger off the shutter button, they'll take off from a landing position. But I got this one, and I just love the trail of water. Even though it's a shot looking away from the camera, it's got this beautiful little trail of water which adds interest to the shot and add something of a narrative. Now, not all dragonflies lay like that. Not all females lay like that. This is the broad-bodied chaser female, and she lays by dipping her abdomen in the water very, very quickly. Anybody who's watched this will know how fast it happens. And it can be really difficult to photograph, particularly when you're lying on the edge of a pond. And I don't use Pro Capture for this. This is a single or sequence, a burst sequence of shots taken using a small AF point positioned pretty much on the abdomen to enable me to get exactly the focus point that I want. And then I'm quite happy if stuff like the head here and perhaps the wings a little bit drift out. I've got ISO 6400 again, fast shutter speed, the om1, 6400, so quite fast. I think it would have been about f6.3 with this one because I wanted to make sure the background detail was sufficiently diffuse that it didn't really badly impact on the impact of the shot, on the punch of the shot. So small autofocus point there, and a fast burst of images and fast shutter speed. Nailed that one. Okay, so what other problems could we encounter doing this kind of photography? Excuse me while I take a drink, drying out. Well, in the summer, on a bright day, on a hot day, I should probably say something mentioning hot day. A couple of pieces of essential gear. A hat, really, really important. A really good wide-brimmed hat will enable you to stay out and do this kind of photography, whereas no hat, you will be retiring to the shade. And I'm afraid I'm a kind of shade kind of guy, and I do often try to find myself in a position where I can shoot these kind of images from the shade of a tree, so looking out into the sun. But the problem with very bright conditions is it leads to very high contrast situations. So you can have real trouble controlling the highlights while still retaining detail in the shadows. And the problem with that is you're pushing the sensor to its absolute limit in terms of dynamic range, in terms of what it can capture. You're going right to the edge. And you often end up with quite a lot of noise in the shadows because if you're exposing for the highlights, you're going to have to lift the shadows, deep shadows later on in post-production. And when you do that, it will increase the noise. And you can see here that one of the problems is when you do that, to then try to reduce noise, you can end up with banding. I don't know whether you can see that on your monitors, but you've got this kind of blocky effect here in this particular image in the outer focus areas where there's a transition from very dark to a more pale tone. And that can be a real problem with this kind of image. So there's a good watchword here. Do your noise reduction before you do anything else, because then you will be working on a noise reduced image rather than doing your noise reduction after you've already introduced a lot of noise into the shadow areas. On the left-hand side here, same thing applies. I've done what I've just said, which is I've reduced the noise first, and then I've increased the shadow detail, and I've retained the highlights. There's still not quite enough shadow detail in there for me, but we're working with the limits of our sensors here, and we're working on an incredibly bright day, and our sensors don't see the same dynamic range that we do. So, to get these kinds of shots anyway is really pleasing. Okay, I just want to say a word about the kind of project ideas that you could have, and some of the things that I've done in the past and I'm thinking about doing now. You could look for different types of insects. You could make your project to photograph 10 species of dragonfly during the year. You could make your project focusing on the life cycle of a dragonfly, like we've got here. This is a downy emerald, and this is just having emerged from its exuvia, its larval case, and this is the teneral. We call the young ones the tenerals. That's just emerged. She's opened her wings and is drying them and is ready to take flight. So you could do that. You could have a whole sequence, a life cycle sequence. Or you could do what I've done, because I've got a lot of shots like that. I got quite intrigued by the interaction of different dragonflies. And I noticed on our garden pond, this was taken with the om1 Mark II several years ago now, and it's obviously not got a fast enough shutter speed because the wings are out of focus. The insect, the emperor dragonfly, is in focus. I've just lost the focus on this azure damsel or common blue. I don't know which without checking. But it had been repeatedly, the dragonfly had been repeatedly annoyed and bombed by this damsel, so much so that eventually it got really hacked off and flew off. And I was just trying to capture that interaction because I think it's really interesting that that is what these guys do, despite the fact that damsels are very often a prey species of a dragonfly. You know, these are big aggressive animals and the damsels are small, but they will even land on their back. And this is the best I've got so far with the dragon stroke damsel interaction. This is a broad-bodied chaser at the bottom and a large red damsel at the top. I am also intrigued at how dragonflies amongst same species will battle amongst each other, and composition isn't always about getting everything absolutely in focus. It's often about introducing a feeling, and I really like this. Is like a dogfight, you know, World War II dogfight. You've got the, you know, the one insect coming down here and bombing a perching a four-spotted chaser, same species coming in, and they were driving each other off the perches. And I was desperately trying to get both of these dragonflies in shot at the same time. It's unbelievably difficult while still retaining background that's out of focus and that's compelling. So to make that image pop, it was just a matter of luck. So I was doing a lot of shooting, again using pro capture and hoping that the dragonfly came across the right plane of focus as it came into frame, and on this occasion it did. But there's a lot more work to do in this, and this is one of my projects for the year, which, fingers crossed, and if the weather improves, and we've had dire weather, this will be one of the things that I start to do in the next couple of weeks. I've tried also, and this is another project for this year, dragonflies or odonts and damselflies with their prey. Wow, that would be great, wouldn't it? Capturing in flight, a bit like you sometimes see with birds of prey capturing their small birds in flight. But this is on a micro scale. You can see the prey item that this demoiselle has got its eye on here. She's looking straight at it, but it's not in focus, which is really annoying. But, you know, plane of focus and all that, you know, we are restricted. And I could have used a wide angle lens and got closer. I could do that, but it would render the background in focus. And of course, that would destroy the punch that the image has. So it's going to be a matter of time, really. I've got halfway there with this one. This is an image of a four-spotted chaser, ready to leave, ready to fly off. There's the prey item here. Chaser is looking at it. Unfortunately, by the time the insect had left the perch and I'd captured the sharp chaser dragonfly in flight, the insect had disappeared. The prey item had disappeared. But it's got this lovely background. That's the other thing I'll be working with this year, is backlighting and interesting backgrounds. So, hey, we've covered a lot of ground. I think I've done about an hour. I've probably gone on too long. If anybody's interested, please email OMS, and I will provide these if they're interested. They're PDF versions of publications on photography of insects and dragonflies that I've done over the last couple of years that you may find interesting. For anybody who might or could find their way down to Devon in July this year, I've got two workshops which I'm running, which have got spaces on, specifically for OM shooters. But, you know, you can come if you're not an OM shooter. If there's anybody here who's not shooting OM and really feels like they might want to check out Pro Capture and see how it all works, there's kit to borrow, etc., etc. 22nd, 29th of July, andrewmccarthyphotography.co.uk, my website. You can check it out on there. So guys, look, that is me done. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to take questions. So I'm going to look through the chat. There's a lot of questions in the chat here. So I am going to see whether I can see anything. And if you want to unmute yourselves and stick your hand up, I can maybe take some questions. But let me just have a quick look through the chat screen first. Okay, nothing that I can see, although I may be doing it completely wrong. Let me just scroll down. Okay. You can unmute yourselves if you want to. And as I say, ping me a thumbs up or something in the chat. And
there were loads of questions
here we go.
for you, Andrew, in
go
the
on.
chat.
I've missed that, but go on.
Yeah, no, I don't know, just want to have, can you see the chat line at all?
I'm struggling to at the moment. I've taken this on. I have to confess, I've taken this on from. Here we are. No, I've got it. Got it. Yeah. Okay. Well, since you're up, Sue, why don't you ask me what you were going to ask me?
I wasn't. I was just pointing out that I've watched loads of people ask you questions.
Okay. Right. Let me go to the beginning. I don't know how much time people have got. I will try to just read through them in chunks, and I will see whether there are generic answers that I can give for a few of these. So firstly, gosh, there's people from all over. Fantastic. Let's have a look. Okay, somebody let me just talk about this because I was looking at this the other day. Kay Wilson says, I love my 4150, but it's let down by the integral lens hood. I'm on my second and it's broken. We'll take it off. Yes, I agree with you. It's really annoying. I've never had a problem with mine, oddly. It's really annoying, but you can buy an ordinary, I can't remember, the 62mm, I think, thread, and you can just use a normal lens hood that you can just clip on and then just use as normal. So yeah, I wouldn't bother buying one. Don't buy one. Okay, Rob Mills. Hi, Rob. What focal length are you generally using? Yes, quite long. Well, it depends on what I'm doing. With static shots, you can use macro, of course, but you're going to be working very close. One of the several advantages to using a long telephoto, generally speaking, with most of these images, I will be working at 400mm. So full frame equivalent, 800, isn't it? So I'm standing maybe 15 feet back, maybe 20 on occasion. So I'm standing a long way back, and that gives me a massive advantage in that it lets me avoid disturbance, and it makes composition much easier because I'm not worried about spooking the insect. So yeah, generally I've become really lazy with this kind of photography because most of these subjects are quite large, and even with the larger damselflies, you know, you've got quite a large subject, so you can get away with a big telly because these OM lenses, and actually most modern telephoto lenses, focus really close. I will use the 4150. That's a really good portable lens to take out with you with a monopod for a whole raft of different types of photography, and I'll use that sometimes with the extender because it's dead sharp even with that. And I will use macro, particularly for static work on emerging dragonflies. So hopefully that answers your question, Rob.
Yeah, I think you've just got a better eye for it than me. I miss them when they're a long way away. So
well, with a zoom, of course, you can always zoom out, pick up the subject, and then zoom right into your composition of choice, if you see what I mean. But anyway, you're coming on one of my workshops, so we can practice that. So that'll be good. Laura Barcy,
you mentioned
go on.
The converter on the that. Which one?
The 1.4. I never use the 2. I don't own it anymore. It does work really well, and I guess you could use it if you had, say, a shorter focal length, if you had the 40-150 and you really wanted to get further back, you could try using the ×2. It is a really good converter. It's just that for me, perfect image quality is key. And I'm hypercritical about sharpness. And so it just doesn't cut the mustard for me. I have used it, and I would use it if in absolute extremis. And while you're doing experimenting and building up your skills, absolutely have a go. Why not? Works really well with the 40-150 because you've still got f5.6, I think, or 5.6 with a ×2. So you've got effectively a 600mm full frame lens with 5.6, great for long distance dragonflies in flight. So yeah, cool.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, go for it.
I use the 400 to 180 with the mk2 on the em1 Mark II, and it's brilliantly sharp on that camera.
Yeah. I mean, it can be. Depends on what you're comparing it to, you see. And unfortunately, as a lot of people will know, if they've got the 150-400, it's or the 300 f4, they're so unbelievably sharp that you put a 2x extender on them and they are softening very slightly. And of course, I often want the flexibility of a wide open aperture. So anyway, let's move on from that if we can, because we've got quite a lot of questions to get through here. What are the settings for the image of the emerging dragonfly
I think
for
you
the
covered
in-camera
that
focus stacking?
straight after I asked.
Oh, okay, Laura. Okay, well, good to see you. Thanks for coming. Any questions? Email me via my website. Anybody's got any questions?
Thank
I'm
you.
always happy to talk about dragonflies and damsels. How do you choose the number of shots and the focus differential? Yeah, that's the big question. It's called experimentation. There's no science behind it. It's experimentation, Jenny, and it is experience. And unfortunately, you need a static subject. But of course, with a static subject, you've usually got time. And with time comes the ability to experiment. My time problems are not usually with the subject. They're usually the fact that I've got to get back for some other work, or I've got family commitments, or I'm only out for an hour. That's why I do a lot of photography locally, because it gives me more time with the subjects. And so how do I choose the number of shots? I guesstimate. And of course, you've got the ability by running a stack. If you choose the right a point in advance of your subject, in front of your subject, you can watch through live view as the stack runs. And as soon as it runs past the point you want it to be sharp, you press the button again and it stops it. So which means that if it stops before the end point, you need to increase the number of focus bracketing points. So if you've started at 30 and you've only got halfway through your stack, well, choose 50 and see if that works. And if it doesn't, choose 60. So, experiment. There's loads of stuff online about this, and email me. I'll have more time in an email to answer. I probably need to do a video on it, but yeah, what size cards do I use? Gosh, what size cards do I use? I need to order some more cards. 64 gig, I think. And I tend to have fairly short shoots. So I guess if I was out all day doing pro capture all day, I might fill one card. And I probably should set my camera up to download onto both cards, so I've always got a backup. But kind of touch wood, I've never had a failed card. So having said that, probably will have a failed card now. And I tend to have one card, I fill that up and it defaults, goes on to the next card. So I've got 128 gig of memory, and that's more than ample. You've got to remember, you're working with a fairly small file size. It's only 20 meg. So these are not massive files. If you were working with a Sony A7R5, I mean, that would just be a complete nightmare because you've got a 60 megapixel file. Suddenly it's 3 times the size of the OM gear. So that's what I use. But yeah, I need to order some more cards. I probably need to order some with greater capacity. I guess I would now. On my Keith Gips. Hi Keith, good to see you here.
How you doing? Yeah,
I'm good, mate. I'm good. I noticed on your SH1 Pro capture settings you have all pre-capture frames set and no post. Well, because by the time I've pressed it, the insect's right over the other side of the pond.
It's
gone.
as simple as that, is it?
It's as simple as that. Yeah,
Yeah,
you could
okay.
try it, but actually, I think you'll find that, you know, by the time you've pressed the shutter button, the insect's way out of the frame.
Yeah, I'm used to bird photography, so we
Yeah,
would
it's
normally
much
with
faster.
birds, it's sort of like 25, probably 15 probes, something like that, you know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do the same with my birds, and often, you know, you're trying to follow the bird as it moves off the perch, but
Yes, of
you
course.
don't have the chance. These guys move so quickly. I mean, it is literally, it's instant. They're gone, bang. As anybody who's watched dragonflies taking off. Kay Wilson says, I've only got part of the text here. It says taking off, but I focus on the perch if the insect's often out of focus. Yeah, well, that's the problem with this technique. You need a fast frame rate, and the only way you're going to do that is with ProCapture SH1, because that gives you 120 frames per second, which is the requisite for these insects because they move so fast. And if you focus on the perch, the insect is often out of focus, and that's because you're not shooting along the plane of the plane that the insect is taking off from. So if you watch a little bit more closely to see where the insect is approaching, you'll find, if that's the perch, you'll find that very often they approach in a particular frame, at a particular angle. You need to be side on to that. Now, and there's no guarantee that the insect won't think, do you know what? He's taking pictures of me. I'm going to take off at a different angle. And that's what they do. And that's just the way it is. And so you need to do lots of this photography, and then eventually you'll start to get sharp shots. So it's about persistence, and that's it, really. It's about trying to compose your image, trying to work out what the insect is doing, positioning yourself accordingly. You can't always, and there is a slice of luck to it. In answer to Susan Ferenczi, due to my work schedule, I joined the Zoom very late. Will be given access to recording. Yes, it will be sent to you, so no problem there. That's been answered. Let me roll down. Justina, hi Justina, not spoken to you for a while. Do I use peak focus tripod provided head, or do you add a new one? I use whatever I happen to have. I've got 4 or 5 tripod heads. I tend to use the peak tripod head. It's really quite good. I don't stick another one on it, but I don't always use that particular tripod. I've got a Bembo tripod. You know, you can use whatever you want, really. I've got a ball head. I've got a gimbal head. God, I've got far too much gear, and it just happens to be whatever's in the car. So, you know, I don't think you need to get too gear orientated here, because this is a static process. If you're talking about doing dragonflies in flight, for instance, you know, very often you're doing slow tweaking, and then you're talking hands off, you know, with your thumb on the remote release, waiting for the dragonfly to do whatever it will do. Hopefully that's answered, you know, so use whatever. You could use a monopod as well if you wanted to. Do I tend to denoise all the images I take at 6400 and above? Laura Barcy, thank you. Laura, I denoise pretty much everything these days.
Right.
It's just become what everybody does, I think. And we do a lot of judging for the Royal Photographic Society, and virtually every image we see now on every camera system seems to be denoised. Sometimes to the point where the images look plasticky, and I think you have to be very careful. I mean, I could stray into post-processing here, you know, and that's not the purpose of this talk, but I think it's easy to overdo it. So I like to use the AI denoise function in Lightroom. And of course, you've got a sliding scale that you can use to apply different levels of denoise. But yes, in answer to Laura, I absolutely do. I would denoise anything at 6400. I like to have a clean image to work with before I go on then to start doing contrast or other adjustments in post-process. I mean, not if I was shooting at 200, I probably wouldn't. It probably wouldn't need it. But again, it depends on the, you know, final output. If you're shooting for social media, people are going to be less critical, you know, on Instagram with a, you know, a small phone size image than they would be if you're producing for a set of prints for an exhibition, for example, you know, two opposite ends of the spectrum. So hopefully that's answered that question.
Is that part of your workflow, Andrew, then, that you always denoise first?
Well, yeah, I always denoise first, but I don't always denoise. I usually denoise, and I'll often denoise, but I'll denoise to different levels depending on the level of noise in the image. So if it's a really, and I did include, and I took it out. I don't know why this. I've got an image that I included that is shot at 20,000 ISO of a black-tailed skimmer in flight, and I shot it accidentally because I manually set the ISO, thought I set it to 6400, couldn't work out why I was getting such a sharp, fast shutter speed, and then realized later that the camera had been I got it on auto ISO instead of manual ISO, and the camera had been exposing for a very dark background, and it had given me 20,000 ISO.
Wow.
And it's still an acceptable image, certainly for social media. I'll post it on my Facebook page later on. And so if anybody wants to friend me as on Facebook, check me out on Facebook or Instagram, I'll post it. But it's unbelievably good with a bit of noise reduction. And it's retained an amazing amount of detail. So says a lot for Micro Four Thirds sensor. You know, when I go back to, I started shooting OM in 2018, so I was shooting the EM1X and the EM1 Mark II, and the om1 and the om1 Mark II are much better from a detail retention point of view at high ISO. Let's move on. Francis Cashcroft. Hi, Francis. How much are your images cropped? Yes, that's a good question, actually, because shooting obviously not so much if I'm shooting portraits, sometimes not at all if I'm shooting portraits. Nice to get it right in camera if you can, usually tweaked a bit, because very often you'll just want to crop and move the image slightly, Francis, but for pro capture work, quite sometimes a fair bit. So maybe the final image is perhaps a third of the image size, and the reason that you need to do that is because obviously you're shooting a sequence, and unless you're doing a composite, and I've never really tried composites with a sequence of takeoff sequence with dragonflies, something I need to do this year, another project. I've done it with butterflies, in which case I would pull back even further. But it's a how do you find that sweet spot of wanting to retain as much detail in the final image as possible, but retaining flexibility in that takeoff sequence so you can get the composition you want? It's a tough call. So kind of 50% perhaps for the flight shots would be a reasonable answer, I guess.
Thank you.
Susan Ferenczi, are you using the MC14? I think we've answered that, haven't we? I use the MC14. Do I use Rolf Riss? Do I use ESP? Rolf, are you there? I don't know what he means by ESP. I'm being thick.
It's electrostatic plane. It's the actual, it's normally you'd use with Nikon and that. I think it's the what's it called?
It's the focus spot, isn't it?
Well,
evaluative or something like that.
Oh, okay.
It's equivalent, isn't it?
Evaluative metering, yeah. Evaluative metering, yeah. I mean, I'm a fairly lazy photographer. The bulk of my brain power goes into creating creative images and not into technology, and I have great difficulty remembering or thinking about anything beyond the basics, as I said right at the beginning. And so consequently I've always shot with evaluative, or whatever Canon call it, matrix metering, that kind of metering across the frame, because it does a good job for portraits. And as I said, sometimes it gets it wrong when the background is very dark and you end up with ISO 20,000 with an auto ISO. So sometimes it gets it wrong, but most of the time it gets it right. And I don't want to think about stuff like that. I just want to think about where am I going to put the subject in the frame, what shutter speed am I going to use, what is my background going to look like, and how do I maximize depth of field. Andrew, can you have too much? This is Mark Gillett. Can you have too much layering in your composition? By layering I mean interest. Can you have too much interest in your composition? If that's what you mean, no, because you want to keep the viewer's eye engaged with your image as much as possible, as much interest. So good lighting, really interesting lead-in lines, diagonals going on to make the image more dynamic, interesting color combinations between the subject and background, action, predation and action, everything. No, bung it all in. Providing your image is compelling and the image pops, then it should work. Keith, any way you can view my F panel? Oh, I don't know, Keith. I genuinely don't know. I was hoping at one point the RPS might put it up as I think it's in the Iris actually, Keith. And I have got that on PDF if anybody's interested.
Okay.
I'm sure that
Thank you.
OM would be happy. I can send that to you because I'm not sure they've got your email address. Rolf on there.
I think you have, because I'm booked up to come with you in July, aren't I?
Oh, in that case, I'll send you a copy if I remember. Send me a reminder.
Thank you.
But can you use BBF? Sue Dahl. Sue Dahl. Hi, Sue.
Hello.
Another one I know. What's BBF? What do you mean? What's BBF? All these acronyms.
Back button focusing.
Oh, yes. Well, my pro capture. I'm doing. Yes, you can. Is the short answer. If you want to, I set my camera up with pro. Yes, pro. You can use back button focus. I'm sure. I know you can. I've used it, but I don't use it for SH2 because there's no need, because the camera is so good at doing what it does, and I'm shooting with the shutter button half pressed. But thinking about it, why would you want to?
Okay.
Yeah, you generally speaking.
Forgive me for
I'm thinking,
intruding, but I thought that you couldn't use back button focus for Pro Capture because Pro Capture starts with the actual focus button itself.
You might be right. I don't know in answer to your question because nobody's ever asked me, and yeah, you may be right, Keith. But to be honest, I don't use autofocus for any of this work. It's all manual because I use manual override to nail the focus in the first place. And then pretty much all the flight shots are shot by using SH1, so it's all manual anyway. So there's a degree of luck because it's too fast. The action is just too fast for autofocus to lock onto the insect. For flight shots where you're panning around trying to get the, what a nightmare that is. Absolute nightmare. I mean, I'm just not good enough at, and you've got to be really good at nailing a small subject. If the insect is really, really, really hovering for an extended period, you might have time to just wind out a bit and then wind in. And then I use front button focus for that. So yes, he's probably right. I just never thought about it because nobody's ever asked me. So but it's not something I use much anyway. So right, let's move on. We've got a lot of stuff here. I think most people are going.
That's it.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. I
must say, Andrew, I have managed to use SH2 with the in-flight.
Yeah, you can.
As you say, when it's hovering, but I'm using 40 to 150 on my own, again, my own pond.
Yeah, you can. I'm just saying that for the kind of for hovering photography, which is different, really. I think to me. I like to have perches. I wanted dragonflies peeling away from the perch, and there's a very specific type of photography. The action happens so quickly, from transition from static to movement is so fast. The camera, well, at least the old camera, couldn't do it. The om1 Mark II may be able to, and I will be trying it, but generally speaking, I just use these two approaches. That's not to say you shouldn't experiment, and absolutely, guys, go off and do your own thing. This is just what I do and what works for me. So yeah, okay. Well, I hope that's answered most people's questions. We've talked a lot. God, it's 20 to 7, so I'm going to end because I need to go and cook some food. So hopefully that was interesting for everybody. And sorry to have banged on about that for too long, and hope you enjoyed it. It's being recorded. It'll be sent to you. So if you really can stand to watch me talk again, you've got the chance.
Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Excellent presentation. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, no worries.
Take care.
Cheers, guys.
Good evening, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.